Thank you. So I think we'll start the formal session, this first session about racism, conservation, and human rights violations of indigenous peoples in Asia. I think we have a very good panel. I think at the outset, I would like to say that there were a couple of other people whom actually we had invited. However, because of the prior commitments, they could not participate. So we have ended up having panelists mainly from South Asia. I'm fully aware that this does not necessarily represent the whole perspective of Asia. I think apart from myself, Suhas Chakma, I work as the director of the Rights and Risk Analysis Group based in Delhi. I work with the National Human Rights Commission of India, which is one of the national human rights institutions in the Asia Pacific region. We have a core group for protection of the human rights defenders. So I'm a member of that. And of course, I have worked on the indigenous issues apart from myself being an indigenous person. Apart from me, I think we have two other excellent panelists here. We have one person from Nepal, Shankar Limbu. He is from Lahonif, one of the first indigenous peoples organizations which focused on legal advocacy. He is a practicing lawyer. He has done fantastic work and excellent work, including on the protected areas in Nepal. And of course, we have the second speaker, Pranav Dole. Pranav is an activist. He is very well known. He is somebody, if you had followed the issue of conservations in India, the controversies surrounding the issues in India, you must have read about the story which the BBC had done. Then the BBC was banned in India, and of course Pranav had to go to jail. Basically, as a community leader, sometimes it's very difficult to find out whether he's inside or outside the jail. At some point of time, of course, at times also he writes quite well in number of newspapers in India. I think it's a bit difficult to be a moderator and also to be the first speaker on the panel. But I think what we will do is, I think there is enough time, at least 1.5 hours for the speakers who will be speaking. So we have sufficient time to deal with some of the issues in depth. Then, of course, the remaining 15 minutes, the panelists would be responding to the comments, questions, and etc. I think in the beginning, I just wanted to bring a little bit about the historical perspectives about the protected areas in India, the challenges which we face today, and of course, the patterns of human rights violations as we have noted, observed, I think, which is known to all in a way. Then at the end, I think what is the way out? I think that's the most critical issue. I think it's a known fact, as has been stated yesterday by a number of speakers, that indigenous peoples have been facing the brunt of saving the world's biodiversity and ecology. The relationship which the indigenous peoples shared with the nature, one of the reasons why the biodiversity is still, ecology is still very, very much in shape, or the areas where you could find the ecology, biodiversity in its pristineness, their role have been recognized, the indigenous people's role. But I would say that even though their role for protection of the environment has been recognized, when it comes to protection of the protected areas, their legal rights have not been codified. And there is a gap between recognition of the contribution, the role of the indigenous peoples, and of course, the need to formally codify or legally recognize their rights, especially in the field of conservation of nature. If we look at in India, I think the concept of conservation is actually relatively new. It's not even 100 years old. It was the British who first created protected areas in the form of reserve forest. So the first conservation laws which we had in India was actually Forest Act of 1947, which empowered the state to define or to designate certain areas as forest areas. Then, of course, with the legislation also came the forest offenses. And of course, the people who were there, they were penalized. So indigenous peoples always had a question in their mind. In the areas which are designated as forest areas, is it the forest officials or the indigenous peoples who came first? Obviously, indigenous peoples have been living there for centuries, and their mere existence, their livelihood practices were simply criminalized. And in fact, on 21st February of this year, in a state called Orissa, this state government has decided to withdraw 48,000 cases. I once again repeat, the state government of Orissa has decided on 21st February that they will withdraw 48,000 cases relating to the scheduled tribe. And these cases were filed for excise offenses, that is making country liquor, forest offenses, and land encroachment. So if in one particular state you have 48,000 cases pending against the indigenous peoples for violations of forest offenses, which basically means following their traditional livelihood practices, you can imagine in this country how many cases are pending against indigenous peoples. As and once this Forest Act came about, and the prosecutions have been continuing, I think the government of India added another area, which is the issue of discussion, that's protected areas. The protected areas, I think when the Special Rapporteur was speaking yesterday, he had mentioned that protected areas were essentially recreational opportunities, hunting grounds for the colonial elites. In India, I think the first national park was established at the Jim Corbett National Park in 1936. Then there were 4 other parks which were established, Kanha and Taudoba National Park in 1955, Madhap National Park in 1959. We, at the moment, have about 106 national parks. And out of this 106 national parks, all the national parks basically came up after the government of India enacted Wildlife Protection Act in 1972. So the protected areas in India is actually a recent phenomenon. It's about 52 years old at this point of time. So it's a recent phenomenon. And I am stretching this particular historical point from only one perspective. That is to say that indigenous peoples have been living in these areas, and once their areas are identified or designated as a forest area, for wildlife protection or as a protected areas, they face enormous amount of human rights violations, and they become offenders in their own land. And if they stay there, they face violations. If they do not stay or they accept the package which is given by the state, then of course they are destroyed completely because they can adjust with their livelihood practices in the new areas where they are settled. And I think at the end of the day, the world is yet to see a good case which could be shown to the world that this is the best case for rehabilitation and resettlement, even in areas where you are given the shared responsibility of co-management. Of course, the indigenous peoples always operate under the command or instructions of the government officials, subservient to them. So their role is extremely limited. So if we look at this, I think one of the most questions which I had in my mind, I had listened to various presentations. What I had in my mind was does this constitute racial discrimination? And I think we have heard yesterday from the legal scholars and etc. And I was looking at the definition of Article 1 of the ISAD, which says racial discrimination is any kind of distinction, exclusion, restriction, preference based on race, descent, color, etc. And what came to my mind is that it may not constitute direct racial racial discrimination, the forms of racial violence we witness, but there's a systematic racial discrimination. And I think one of the key issues in this whole debate has to be the descent of the origin or descent or origin of the indigenous people from particular territories which are targeted for, the protected areas. And descent is not or need not necessarily be uh, based on the occupational inheritance as described by the SAD committee in its general comment number 29. I think it also includes the descent which are in analogous kind of discrimination. And what I had in my mind particularly is the disproportionate targeting of indigenous peoples for protected areas. And of course, I had looked into other countries, but when I looked at India, I mean, I had found out that at this point of time, the government of India had notified 106 national parks. I am not talking about wildlife sanctuaries and etc. The government of India has 106 national parks. And when I conducted the preliminary research to present this paper, I found out that out of this 106 national parks, 89 national parks impacted the indigenous peoples. So it's about 84% of the populations who are 84% of the parks had indigenous peoples. So if you look at the other way, the indigenous peoples in the country constitute about 8.6% of the population, but about 86% of the protected areas in the country involve or inhabitants of indigenous peoples who are directly impacted by it. And when I looked at the other parks, the remaining 17 parks, 4 were Jews, which were in the cities. 4, we could not find adequate information whether they had indigenous peoples. 2 were marine areas in Andaman Nicobar Island, not habitated or inhabited by any indigenous persons. It's only in 7 parks that non-indigenous peoples were affected. So if we look at this proportionality of indigenous people being targeted, it's really staggering. And if we look at this past practice, and of course it's different in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Cambodia, I just had this target 3 of the Kunming Montreal Global Diversity Framework, which was mentioned in the briefing paper, the guidelines which we prepared for the university. That's that, by 2030, the protected areas, etc., should be increased by 30%. And if we are to increase this 30% from the existing 16%, what kind of impact it will have on the indigenous peoples? Especially if we look at, if I may say, the past practices where in India, if we have 106 national parks, 89 out of them are affected or by the indigenous peoples. And if we look at the present patterns of the expansion of the protected areas, I think I have found 3 particular areas which are being expanded. One is in Kumbhalgarh Wildlife Sanctuary in Rajasthan. Again, it's involving the indigenous peoples. And the second one is in Madhya Pradesh, which is Noradehi Sanctuary. Again, once again, the indigenous people are being evicted from or on the face of eviction from the core areas or the nearby areas. And I think what I found most devastating in a way is when I undertook a field visit on 2nd and 3rd of February this year in a place called Borak Bhuvan Wildlife Sanctuary in Assam, which has been notified in 2022. So when I read the official notification, which is available in the website of the ministry also, under section C relating to rights and concessions, It says, I quote, the area is free from encroachment as per record. There are no rights and concession of any person in the area, unquote. So basically saying there is nobody which can make any kind of claim if this particular area is to be designated as a wildlife sanctuary. So when I visited the area, lots of indigenous peoples came to see me, and we found that the villages have records which have been in existence from, as per the official documentation of the official records of the government of Assam, from 1914. So they have records for over a century. And of course, the government of Assam has been providing all the facilities in terms of the healthcare facilities, school facilities, electrification, water supply. People are paying taxes for the lands which they use. And of course, I mean, ignoring all these ground realities, the official notification states that there is nobody who could claim any kind of rights or concessions. So I think if we look at the human rights violations, the first challenge which the indigenous peoples face is to establish their own existence on their own land with documents, with evidence. And how many people actually are issued documents, or how many people are able to preserve documents for hundreds of years? Because you never know at what point of time in history that your area will be designated as a protected area when the whole struggle begins. So I think the first challenge is to claim yourself that you are a resident there, you exist there. And I think it's the biggest challenge which indigenous peoples face all over the world, because if you are not able to prove your existence in an area from a particular period of time, you cannot claim any rights. For example, if you want to claim your forest rights, obviously you had to be in that area with official documentation from 31st December 2005, prior to 31st December 2005. And if you cannot prove your existence, even if you have been living there for centuries, you do not exist. And I think this is the first challenge which indigenous people face. The second challenge which we face, I mean, all over Asia, I think the right to free, prior, and informed consent is not recognized under the law. It is recognized under the Section 4.1 of the Panchayati Extension to Scheduled Areas Act of India, as well as Forest Rights Act. But if we look at the number of judgments which have been coming up from the Supreme Court and the High Courts, I would say that the respect for the free, prior, and informed consent is an exception. Its violation is the rule, and it's a continuous engagement with the judiciary, which indigenous peoples cannot engage. At the end of the day, you require resources, you require legal expertise, and of course, you are living in areas which are designated as protected areas, that's far off places, almost cut off from rest of the universe. So it becomes very, very difficult for indigenous peoples to fight at the level of the High Court, at the level of the Supreme Court, when fighting a case at the High Court and Supreme Court is really, really expensive. There are lawyers, an excellent lawyer in Delhi would charge possibly ₹1 million for one hearing or more than that. So in that kind of a situation, how could indigenous peoples, even if their rights are recognized, will fight back? So sometimes, even when your rights are legally recognized, you just cannot use the law because you do not have the resources. The third issue, I think, which I want to mention is once your area is notified, the choice which you are given is extremely unfortunate. You are damned if you do it. If you are damned if you do not do it. And I think the first problem we face when an area is notified, despite your right to free, prior, informed consent, and please remember in this particular phase, the right to free, prior, informed consent does not come up at the stage of issuance of notification. Your free, prior, informed consent comes up only once the notification is issued. So therefore, you have no say whatsoever whether a particular area should be designated as a protected area or not. Of course, once you are or your area is notified as a designated area, then you could say, I want to stay here, I don't want to go out, etc. So please remember, the free prior informed consent all over the world is also twisted in a manner that you exercise that particular right only when the process has started. And once the process starts, the first steps taken by the state authorities all over Asia or anywhere in the world is to stop any kind of development initiative, is to deny any kind of rights, so that your situation inside the parks become actually untenable. So that's why I said, I mean, if you accept it, you are damned. If you do not accept it, you are damned. Suppose you win the right to stay inside the parks, protected areas, exercising your right to free, prior, informed consent. That's not necessarily the end of the beginning of the happy story. Your story ends the moment your area is notified as a designated area. Because the moment the national park is declared or created, and if you are allowed to live inside the forest areas, there are severe restrictions from the state authorities, conservation authorities, as well as the agents, whether it's the private contractors or private actors, ecotourism promoters, on your freedom of movement, your security at the gate, your requirement for permission for entry, exit, security checks of the bags you are coming in, and etc. Your relatives cannot come in. You have no right to privacy, excessive surveillance, whether you guys are involved in any kind of activities. Then, of course, search operation, that you are recovering this kind of prohibited items or etc. And these searches take place in the middle of the night, where women and girls are sexually assaulted. And of course, you do not have control over your cultural practices, because that may disturb the national park and etc. And within that national park area, because it's a national park, other development activities never takes place. You do not have connectivity to roads, electricity, drinking water facilities, educational facilities. The worst case scenario is the health, because even when there is a health emergency, you still require permission of the authorities of the protected areas to go out. So therefore, women, especially the pregnant women, etc., suffer. And most often than not, the indigenous peoples who live inside these territories, they will be facing different kind of charges. They will be facing charges of poaching, as I said, about forest offenses because of your livelihood practices. Then, of course, you have, as I had mentioned, excise cases, which is making country legal, etc. And so this is not unique to India. It takes place in Indonesia. If you look at the practices in the this Ujung Kulon National Park, or in Cambodia, this Bangpar Wildlife Sanctuary, or in Cambodia, this Bottom Sako National Park, it's common. So that's what if you stay. And if you do not stay, I had mentioned, if you accept the rehabilitation package, the world has not seen a good case for rehabilitation and resettlement, irrespective of what the conservation actors might say or the authorities might say. Rehabilitation, resettlement means you are detached from your traditional livelihood practices. You cannot adjust with that. You basically become extinct, and more so if you belong to extinct or endangered indigenous communities. And I think the last point which I want to mention here is the biggest threat which is posing at this point in time is the ecotourism, as well as sustainable ecotourism, which is once again recreational activities for the elites from all over the world. And if we look at today about conservation, I think it is less about conservation, and it is more about promoting tourism and ecotourism. And when I looked at some of the cases, we'll be sharing the video later on. How do the indigenous peoples participate in this ecotourism activities? And what I had seen in the ecotourism activities, that we have the videos, we'll be sending it to the university, that indigenous people, especially women, girls, and elderly people, they are dressed up in their traditional dresses. There will be traditional replicas of their traditional houses, and they will be made to sit there for the whole day for the tourists to look at. At some point of time, you perform traditional music, dances, etc. They are often held captive against their wishes, and they have to remain there till all the tourists leave. And at the end of the whole process, indigenous peoples participating in this ecotourism project actually are projected like animals in a zoo. So that's a reality. If you go in many areas, that is what exactly you will find. And I have about 3-4 minutes. So if this is the kind of situation which I had illustrated in Asia, then I think what are the way forward, or what are the way we could look at? I think the first principle which you have to realize is that protected areas are not only about biodiversity ecosystem. It's also about people who are living there. If human beings are living there, then I think the principle or application of the principle of human rights or human rights standards must come. But if we look at today, till now, it's gradually developing. The language of rights is mostly absent, whether it's the private conservators or government conservators. And for them, the protected areas mean they are plants and species on one side, then on the other side, the criminals, who are either the indigenous people not willing to leave, or poaching or encroaching. Of course, then there are other professional poachers, etc. And to address this situation, the law enforcement agencies, either state or the private actors, they have been given a wide range of powers to arrest and at times even exercise or use firearms without any common structure and without any respect for the UN code of conduct for the law enforcement officials, including on the use of firearms. And what do we have at this point of time? What we have is basically you have certain private actors saying we have grievance mechanisms. The grievance mechanism where Caesar judges Caesar. So they are looking their own conducts, and the fortresses which the protected areas are they are not looked at by any institution, whether national institutions or others. They are just part of some other rights, whether it's eviction or displacement, etc. But as something specific, the protected areas are not looked at, and protected areas at the end of it, they end up being like something like, you could say, Guantanamo Bay. It's somewhere up there. Nobody should look at it. There are also no justice delivery institutions, or nobody is examining these issues, and etc. So the challenge which remains for us, I think we need a new approach wherein we have to encourage the human rights institutions at national level, regional level, and at the UN level, that look, time has come to look at the protected areas or examine human rights issues in those areas separately. It should not be part of either this community, it should be part of particular thematic issue, displacement, etc. I think there is a need to look at protected areas as a separate issue. And I am quite certain if there is going to be any independent audit by any national institution or regional institution into the protected areas, the extent of human rights violation which will come up is enormous. So I think what we have to look at is basically to stress the point that if we do not succeed convincing ourselves, convincing the institutions which are dealing with rights issues, that you need to examine human rights issues or the in protected areas, or protected areas to be looked from the prism of rights or right-based approaches, I do not think we will be successful to address the violation, especially if we are to look at the targetry of the Kunming-Montreal framework. So with that, I think I'll finish my presentation, and thank you for bearing with me. It has been half an hour. It has been quite a long presentation, and thank you to the IPLP, the University of Arizona, for giving this opportunity. Thank you. So after this, I think we'll move to the next speaker. I just wanted to check whether Shankar is there. Shankar, if you could kindly start your presentation. You have 30 minutes.
Yes, Suhas. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank to University Arizona, and also thank to Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program, Indigenous Rights and Protected Areas, distinguished professors, and fellow students and audience. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity. I'm going to focus on the case of Nepal. So based on our experience, our organization's experience working on protected areas issues, particularly focusing to defend the rights of indigenous peoples, and bringing their issues and the cases in judiciary, and also bringing their issues to reform the laws and policies. That is very important. And also empowering the communities, making aware about their rights so the people can defend their rights themselves. So the overall issues since yesterday, we have been focusing the protected areas is also a kind of institutions or a kind of initiative that is a source of racism, and also it is the source of colonizations. So I will focus a little bit about how the protected areas in the case of Nepal is equivalent to colonization, and it is equivalent to racism. And the second one, I'm going to share some of the examples of the national park and hunting reserves and other protected areas cases that we have been dealing. And the third one, some of the challenges, and the fourth one, to overcome from these kinds of challenges, what initiative that we have been doing. Yesterday, special rapporteurs were focusing or mentioning about some of the good practices. I mean that some professors who was mentioning about the good practices, referring to the idea of former Special Rapporteur James Naya. So in the context of Nepal, let me share about my presentation. So in the context of Nepal, the conservations or protected areas resembles a caste system based colonization and racism that is against the indigenous peoples. when we looked about the definition of racial discrimination, Article 1 of the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, that it will be quite easier for us if we looked about different types of or models of racism, then how it has been actually people are facing in different different communities in different countries. In Nepal, if you looked about the protected areas, if you looked in a map, these are the protected areas, national parks and hunting reserves, and also other conservation areas. That is all established in the indigenous peoples' territories and indigenous peoples' ancestral lands. And then it is quite interesting to know about the history, why these protected areas actually not established but declared by the government in the indigenous peoples' territories. Many people believe that it is rich in biodiversity. So indigenous peoples are protecting the biodiversity. That's why protecting the environment, protecting flora and fauna, and protecting ecology. That's why that's the reason why protected areas were declared in the indigenous peoples' territories. In one hand, that is true, but other hand, that is the different scenario you can see it. If you link to it the colonization in the context of Nepal that is based on the caste-based discrimination, we have to go a little bit about the history. In the history, when the whole country, it was the indigenous territories, it was indigenous nations ruled by the indigenous peoples, different indigenous peoples. And when there was the outsiders who came to indigenous lands, and they slowly and gradually, by use of different techniques and different strategies and conspiracies, they established their regime that was based on Hindu caste system. First of all, they imposed Hindu religion, that the caste system, there is a hierarchy, there is a high caste, and then the indigenous peoples, they categorized in non-caste, but their status in the caste system is second class. Second class. And the last, there is a third category, that is the Dalit. So if you looked about this pyramid, that's how the state is structured. It is based on Hindu religion, Hindu caste system, and also laws were imposed, laws were passed to institutionalize these colonizations. And then indigenous peoples were categorized in two groups. One is unenslavable groups, and another is enslavable groups. What does that mean is there are some groups who can be made slave if they commit a certain crime, and then they will be punished as a capital punishment. They were awarded the capital punishment. Certain example, the cow slaughter. If anyone commits about the cow slaughter, that is considered as a heinous crime, and then they will be awarded the capital punishment, and their property, including land, it is confiscated. And so this is directly targeted to the indigenous peoples. And then some groups are categorized unenslavable. That means that there is a divide between the indigenous peoples. That's why we term this category is a clearly colonization or the strategy of the colonialist force. They divide and they rule the indigenous peoples. So that was based on the Hindu system, as I mentioned about it. And then the lands of indigenous peoples that were snatched and given to the rulers and given to the high caste groups. They called is a birta. So the religious motivation of lands, motivation of land grants to the Brahmins mean the high caste, for instance, was one of the primary factors in the emergence of Birta system in Nepal. So that is the one example. And there are numerous examples to prove that Birta grants were made by the rulers and rewarded to victorious generals and to win over the reward and those who supported their newly established authority. So that's when they started what they called is the unification of the nation. But the indigenous peoples, they consider is aggression, invasion of their nations. The one and another, when the army, they win over the indigenous peoples, then that land given to these armies. That's how the indigenous peoples lost their land. And these, the rulers and the army generals are from the high caste. So the another one is, as I mentioned, the imposition of the Hindu system or value system, Hindu religious system. They consider the cow as a holy animal, and indigenous peoples, they also use meat of cow or oxen to organize or to organize the ritual that is necessary for them, but that was criminalized. And in 1805, there was the royal decree. First, it was imposed, and then that royal decree says that from today, killing a cow is prohibited. If somebody does cow slaughter, that is the responsible, or they will be awarded capital punishment and will take place, and we confiscate his properties. That land will be confiscated. From now on, the killer of the cow should be killed by Amali, is a district officer. So we can imagine about that. They will be killed and their property will be confiscated. That remained for almost 23 years. So we can imagine that what impact that happens because of this degree. And in 1854, there was a national court. It was introduced that institutionalized this Hindu caste system and implanted the concept of divide and rule, as I mentioned about earlier, which is called the slaveable and enslavable indigenous peoples. So that was a big background, and how this is exactly we can see these kinds of racism and colonization that was used in the protected area. So before going that, I would like to mention about it, the racism that is unchallengeable in the context of Nepal. So one of the advocate who brought a case in the Supreme Court challenging the provision of cow slaughter, claiming that it is based on a racial supremacy and criminalizes the indigenous people's cultures. And the court denied the admissibility and also issued an order that any lawyer who brings this kinds of case, he can be blacklisted. So that's why you can imagine about that. There is no access to justice if you challenge about this Hindu value and Hindu this system that was imposed to the indigenous peoples. And this is a kind of the pattern that been through the indigenous peoples. Exactly, this is, if you looked about that, the indigenous peoples' existence and indigenous peoples' right and indigenous peoples' dignity, it is always been challenged and violated everywhere. So which is continuous from the time of the history, the legacy of these kinds of laws and these kinds of policy, it is still continue and reflects in the the protected areas. So some of the cases, let me allow to share about it. It's about the Chiton National Park, which was established in 1973. Let me mention about the Racial Discrimination Convention was ratified by Nepal in 1971, but after 2 years, this Chiton National Park was established or declared by the government. 60,000 indigenous peoples from 6 villages evicted while establishing this national park, and then 27 women were raped, and six women were raped and killed, and no action was taken against the perpetrators. And then this clearly shows that the dignity, the right to life, which is mentioned in the Constitution, which is guaranteed in the Constitution, not only the recent Constitution that was promulgated in 2015, but there were other constitutions, the previous constitutions, they also guaranteed right to life, and also they guaranteed the dignity of the people. But indigenous peoples, their dignity, it was not taken into account. So it was violated severely while establishing the Chitwan National Park. Why that happens? Because indigenous peoples, because of the colonization and racisms, because of the caste systems, their dignity, it doesn't count. So that is the example. And then, if you looked about the incarceration rate in the national park, let me give you an example again for the Chiton National Park. The one study that shows about a study on the conservation enforced that insights from the people incarcerated for wildlife crimes in Nepal shows that 75% of indigenous peoples and then 15.5% from dominant groups, and Dalit, who is the bottom of the caste system, they make like 5.2%, and the other Indian and Chinese 4.2% have been incarcerated in the crime of illegal wildlife trafficking, and largely the marginalized indigenous communities from the Tamang. So the Tamang, Tharuj, and Chepang, these are the groups considered enslavable group in the civil court. So their land is taken to establish the protected areas, and these peoples are considered as still considered. I mean, I'm sorry to say about it. That's like the subhumans. So if you looked about the the cases, protected areas in Nepal looks like a killing field. The death, I mean, some of the examples, what we did at fact findings in the national parks. So the death and then torture, killings, rape, that is continue until 2020s. And then it is rampant. And the sexual harassments against women, it's still continue. And one of the things that when we talked with these victims, especially the indigenous women, and then we asked them, why don't you, why don't you bring the complaint against to the perpetrators? And they answered us that, what will happen? Because this happens routinely. And we talked with one of the victims. She was attempted raped by army personnel. And in the compensation, she was given like 5 kilos of potatoes, 5 kilos of rice, and 1 liter oil. So you can imagine about how, what kinds of situation the indigenous women are facing in the protected area. So this is the situation, the gross human right violation, and then the strategy. How, the protected areas or conservation they are using is to cut down the lifelines of indigenous peoples. What does that mean? That means indigenous peoples' lifelines are the pasture lands, because they grow, they do the animal herding. And then the pastoralism and pasture land is their lifeline. The customary forest that they have been protecting generation to generation, it's a source of their food. And then they collect the medicines and everything. And also the rivers, these are the lifelines. So in establishing the protected areas, now what the government is doing, increasing the protected areas in order to meet the target 2030, the 30% of target. So they are increasing the buffer zone, and then the buffer zone, to establish the buffer zone, they are declaring the pasture land as a buffer zone. So that will directly impact to their livelihood subsistences. And also they are declaring buffer zone, the customary forest also. So that is how the strategy the government is doing. So these are the strategy. So what are we doing now to face these kinds of challenges? Sometimes it's quite difficult for us when we sit in the capital or when we sit in the city as a lawyer, when the community tells us that the armies are coming with elephant to burn down our houses in the middle of the rainy season. So we are sometimes helpless. So at that time, we can't do anything else. So that means that the available means available the institutions they're supposed to protect about the people's life, supposed to protect about the human rights. It cannot be used, it cannot be approached. So that's kinds of situations. I remember that one of the case that is about the forced eviction, burning down the Chepang's indigenous people's houses in the rainy season. The case was brought in the Supreme Court. The judge's attitude was saying that these peoples are destroying the environment, entering into the forest illegally, entering into the protected areas. They don't understand this is the homeland of these indigenous peoples. And it's the indigenous peoples actually who protected this, the forest, who protect the environment. Let me share about the one data about the Chiton National Park. When it was established in 1973, they enumerated about one-horned rhinoceros. The number was 1,000 one-horned rhinoceros. When national park was established, the number was subsequently reduced, and then it became like 300 only. So who is doing the poaching? Because the national park is guarded by the army. So they almost, it's a place where martial law is imposed. And then who is killing this one-horned rhinoceros? Now the Chiton National Park is claiming that it's a zero poaching year, and the number of rhinoceros, they say that it is increased, but it's only 960. So this data shows that indigenous peoples are better protectors. They are the custodian of the animals and the environment. So now this looking about these whole things, we are looking at how to face practically what are the available opportunities that are in place. So now, as I mentioned, that we do have a number of international human rights instruments that protects the indigenous peoples. That also relates to recognize the indigenous peoples customary practices to protect the environment and then protect the biological diversity and protect the ecology. So that is the Convention 169 that was ratified by Nepal in 2006, and also the UNDRIP that Nepal adopted in 2007. Nepal ratified the SHIRT in 1971. Nepal ratified the other international human rights instruments like Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenants in 1991. And these international instruments has a very strong position in the context of Nepal. We have a Treaty Act 1991 that places the international laws are higher position than the national laws. It is considered as equivalent to the national law. If there is inconsistency, then international laws prevails. And then recently, the government of Nepal is in the process of adopting National Action Plan on Kunming-Montreal framework. And we do have indigenous concept of conservation. What does that indigenous concept of conservation is? I will share with you the two concepts. One is the concept of Magar indigenous peoples, which is from the western part of Nepal, and the government established a hunting reserve in that area, and then the Magar indigenous peoples, their customary values, their norm says that the house is a cape and the forest is actual house and the source of the foods. So that's why we do have to protect the forest if we want to survive as a human beings. And also their the customary practices and tradition and cultures, they consider the forest not only the sacred, but the lands, their ancestral lands that comprises the mountains, that comprises the hill, that comprises the plain. These are all sacred for them. So they are actually protecting these lands and according to their culture. And then if you looked about my own community, I belong to the Limbu indigenous community. We have Mundum, which is the oral tradition, and it's a customary law. And it's also, it has a rich jurisprudence relating to customary protection of environment and the environment. and biodiversity. So there is a story about we call it the Kesami and Namsami. Kesami is a symbol of tiger, and Namsami is a human being. They are the son, both are son of one mother. So that's why we always consider the animals as our brothers, and then we are not different. We have to live together. That kinds of concept we have it. So how we can protect, how we can, use in this situation where there are biggest challenge that we have been facing, the gross human rights violation we are facing, and then how we can revitalize or how we can strengthen our system of protection of environment, our system of protection of biodiversity, or system of protecting conservation. So recently, the local municipal government from one province, they passed a law, what they call is the local environment law on protecting environment and also promoting the ecotourism. That is from the Botkola municipality, and they also pass not the act, also pass the regulatory to substantiate what is recognized under this law. That law recognized that indigenous practice, traditions, knowledge, and customary institutions and customary laws relating to protection of environment. The acts recognize indigenous way of life, traditional occupation, such as pastoralism, collecting medicines, cultures, values, and norms. That acts facilitate the ecotourism for the economic development of indigenous communities. So this is an opportunity what we have seen. This act was passed based on the international instrument that is ratified by Nepal, and also to recognize the existing indigenous practice of protecting the environment, protecting biological diversity. So this is the one example. And the other municipalities also now recognizing the indigenous system of protecting environment in accordance with these new initiatives, such as like Kunming Montreal framework, that kinds of things. So this will hope that the historical injustices, what they faced because of the racism and colonization, that was also replicate while declaring the protected areas, that may not be addressed all, but however, what systems indigenous peoples are still protecting, that can be recognized, and that can be also strengthened by passing the law in the municipal level. In our experience, Nepal is a federal country. Passing law from the provincial level and passing law from the federal level, it's quite challenging. But in the local level, the municipal level, it's quite easy for the community because they have a direct in touch with the local government, and mostly the local government, almost like 29% of the local government is controlled by the indigenous peoples. However, the challenge is those the politicians who are elected in the local government, they don't meaningfully represent about the indigenous peoples. They don't really represent interest of the indigenous peoples. That is the challenge what we have been facing. The third one, also the gross human right violation, we have been mobilizing the National Human Rights Commissions, and obviously we all know about that. there is an independent panel commissioned to look about the WWF activities that was commissioned by the WWF, that was chaired by the former Office of the High Commissioners, Nabi Pillai, and Special Rapporteur from the Environment and Human Rights, Professor John Knox, and Professor Catherine McNinnon was the members.
Shankar.
They came up with a very, yes, sorry, and then came up with a very good report that makes changes, and also the special rapporteurs initiatives, rights of indigenous peoples, making a quite positive change. So we are approaching to the international human rights mechanisms as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shankar, for a detailed presentation on the situation in Nepal. It was quite useful, especially the new legislations which are being brought to, in a way, give legal framework to the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, and of course, at the same point of time, promote ecotourism, etc. So may I now invite Pranav Dole, who is from the All Kaziranga Affected Communities Rights Committee. So, Pranav, you have the floor.
Hi, Suhas.
Hi.
Hello, hi. And hello, everyone, and everyone on the floor. And thanks, Suhas and Shankar, for putting up a very expansive idea about what is happening in the region, like India, Nepal, and also kind of from their expertise and experiences of decades. They have talked about the laws and legalities and also the actual conditions of how indigenous communities are having to go through different forms of racial and caste-based discrimination, because both the countries, I mean, even though not expressly through the constitution, somehow are dominantly Hindu majoritarian states, and as a result of which the question of caste is very relevant and important in kind of talking about the whole idea of conservation in these two spaces. And hello everyone, I'm Pranab, and I come from Kaziranga, Bokagat, which is in Assam, in the northeastern part of India. I'm in very close to Myanmar, Bhutan, shares boundary with close to China, not very far from Nepal as well. And already my colleagues and comrades have put out a lot of realities of what is happening in protected areas and national parks across these two countries. And so I think like I would try to like put out a conversation based on my lived experience, belonging to an indigenous community. I mean, coming from an area which falls under a national park, a protected area, and also a tiger project area. What are the kind of day-to-day realities and lived experiences that we have to go through? And so it's basically not having outright an answer to a lot of questions, but trying to put out to the audience like what it is to be like to be living in an fortress or a militarized protected area, and how local communities, indigenous communities are dealing with it. What are the political realities, and in the process also maybe trying to find some answers. I would also accept the fact that it's a little very awkward for me to be speaking to a screen, since I am also a political worker and active politician in the parliamentary process of this country. I stood for the elections to the assembly in 2021. So by default, I'm used to speaking to large crowds and interacting on a very physical level. So still not, very savvy to be talking on to the screen. So please pardon me if there's some sort of awkwardness in my presentation. So we around Kaziranga, if I give you a brief history of Kaziranga, it started in, the history goes back like definitely very long, but it has a colonial history. So Kaziranga was declared as a reserve forest in the year 1905, uh, comprising an area of 232 square kilometers. And then gradually it was changed into a game reserve, and then ultimately into a national park in 1974, and it was also honored as the UNESCO World Heritage Site in the year 1985. And in 2007, it was declared as a Tiger Project area. So the journey of Kaziranga is it started off with an area of 232 square kilometers, but today it stands with an area it claims to be of 1100 plus square kilometers. So there has been an addition of more than almost 1,000 kilometers to the initial boundary that it declared itself to be comprising of. And all this has definitely come at the cost of local and indigenous communities, because the relationship of people with the wildlife, with the flora and fauna, has been there for decades, forever. So this whole formation of binary of national park as spaces of exception and completely curtailing of the access and entry, or seeing them as the others, is a very modern day phenomena, like which Suhas has already explained. And with increasing militarized model of conservation, considering the rhinoceros or the Royal Bengal tiger as the flagship species that needs to be protected, is further alienating the people from their own spaces. And in the process, even our previous speaker has spoken about how indigenous communities look at forest, or how indigenous communities or local communities look at wild animals and the flora and fauna. So in majority of the indigenous and local communities, we find that their cosmological and their existential understanding of their own being also comprises the territories that they reside in, wherein comes in the forest, the rivers, the wild animals. For a small example, like the community that I come from, we do have deities from the forest, most of them, like the elephants are worshipped, the tigers are worshipped by, because communities are also involved in pastoralism and agriculture and fishing. So there are rivers that are revered, the hills that are revered, and this relationship is not purely religious. It is also a very concrete, materialistic, dialectical relationship that that living beings or spaces and humans and the spaces that they live in, they share with each other. So it also progresses accordingly. But then the very modern outlook of conservation doesn't take into consideration the knowledge base of local communities who reside in these areas, and as a result of which there is forceful erasure of people's history, their memories, their alienation happens, and it's a very violent process. It happens both at a physical and an ideational level, at a psychological level, and it's a whole gamut of different tools, weapons, and machineries and political powers that is used against local indigenous communities, and local indigenous communities have to live with this reality on a constant basis. So in Kaziranga, if we try to embody these observations, what we see is there has been a very high rate of militarization in the process. So there's use of different lines of security, like forest guards, special task forces to protect the rhinos, to protect the tigers. There are commandos, I mean, trained to kind of patrol civilian territories around the forest, and also for quick responses. They are using modern, I mean, arms and ammunitions, and also technologies of surveillance like cameras, drones, and many other means, and also very physical entities to kind of spy people within the community. So it is a kind of a situation where you are being constantly surveilled, and in the process where communities are broken down, they are made more insecure, they are constantly doubting everyone, they are constantly at the fear of being victimized and being persecuted as well. And also there has been an instance where immense amount of immunity has been given to the forest rangers and guards to use their weapons on people whoever they consider to have entered into the forest territory. And now the whole idea of territory or boundary, it's also sort of an confusing idea, because these territories that they claim to be theirs, where people cannot go in or cannot come out, belong to this local indigenous communities. Since I have already mentioned that it started off with 232 square kilometers of area, and today it stands at more than 1100 square kilometers of area. And where did this land come out from? It was not artificially created. These were real spaces which communities have been using for times immemorial. So it's a process where it's a very forceful and a violent displacement of people from their own ancestral spaces, from their uh, memories, from their knowledge bases, and that in a way pauperizes the community to not be able to resist, to not be able to create their own future ahead, to not be able to kind of unite together and fight. So these are the some of the ramifications that we see around these spaces. And another attack that has been happening on the spaces of Kaziranga is through, like Suhas has explained about ecotourism. But in Kaziranga, we also see a very corporate model, capitalist model of tourism, where huge international and national five-star hotel ranges like Grand Hyatt or the Taj hotels and many other hotel chains have come in. And this uh, and it is also through a very chronic processes where the government is very lenient in providing the space to these people. But on the other hand, there are communities who stand the risk of getting evicted because they do not have documents, which the documents to the land that they have been using for generations, and which is as a result of the government never considering that the communities who have been residing there should be granted legal entitlements to the spaces that they occupy. And from the perspective of indigenous and local communities, documents have never been the most important concern for the people. I mean, for them, it's a territory where it's where where the connection is beyond just mere documents. It's about living with each other. But the modern state definitely doesn't take into consideration all this kind of logic, because they are based on very, I mean, evidences which are very concrete, and for them the concrete evidences is only papers, and papers are again the authority of kind of giving papers also again rest on the hands of bureaucrats and government officials who are somehow lenient in the process of considering the demands of the people. And so recently there has been like a huge, I mean, disposition of local land by the tourist complex, and also like the constant expansion of Kaziranga, which is there's this concept of they have come up with, and Kaziranga has a territory that they had. So the concept of addition is also very alien in the whole discourse of conservation as well. Like, so if today they want to add some more space, they'll add it as in first edition, second edition. Today they stand on the 11th edition. And all these additions have come at the cost of local communities, their spaces, their rivers, their grazing grounds, and these has like kind of pushed the communities away, and a conflictual relationship has been brewing, and it is seen that there has been a lot of conflict between the forest governance, the forest department, and the local indigenous and local communities. And there has been like resistance from the part of the people in Kaziranga. The state or the forest department uses mechanisms like typecasting or showing indigenous communities as poachers or people who would as poachers, and that as an excuse to kind of have extrajudicial access to the communities, tortures, arrest, detention, fake encounters. And Suhas has already mentioned about the film that BBC made, and there are a lot other documents about it as well, which definitely is available online. Talks about the encounter regime in Kaziranga, and the huge number of local youth who were murdered in the process as well, fakely encountered without any legal recourse to that, because once the immunity that the forest guards or the forest department has to shoot people inside the park, to use arms basically inside the park, and when someone is found inside the park, their body is found inside the park. So there's no prima facie evidences that would say that what has happened inside the park. And magisterial and inquiry processes are never carried out. We have tried to contest these processes, and also have been targeted by the forest department and the state. We have been falsely accused, charged, arrested, detained, put into jail multiple times, and still like there are more than 6 cases that are there against me and my comrades. And so few of the incidences that we have had to struggle are very simple. It's like we're not demanding anything which is very big. Like if a 5-star hotel is coming up in the land of our ancestors or our land that we are using, so if we're saying that like no, we don't want to give you that land, and if we're asking for the due processes, even that becomes a crime. And the forest department puts charges on us. There was an incident where like a livestock farmer, a buffalo herder, basically 5 of his buffaloes were killed by tiger in a night, in one single night. The mother and cubs came in and actually killed 5 tigers in his shed. Sorry, 5 buffaloes in the shed. And next morning, when we tried to asked the forest department to take action, as in legally compensate the farmer. They didn't want to come down to the village saying that, oh, you guys are trouble creators. If we go there, there'll be problem, this and that. But we have been demanding for the longest time for a proper mechanism of compensation and rehabilitation of of people who were affected in this manner. Like there has been multiple deaths by elephants, wild buffaloes, rhinos in the last year itself. So it's an increasing conflict between both like the wildlife and the farmers and the villagers, and also the forest department, who is not taking care of any of the situation or taking any steps to resolve this. So in the process, I guess like there are a couple of questions that come up in protected areas, and also the idea of how to sustain it. And one primary thing is also like every space would have their own carrying capacity. Now in Kaziranga, they claim to have more than 2,500 or 3,000, the Great Indian one-horned rhinoceros. So I guess like scientifically, I mean, how much is possible the carrying capacity? I mean, that also needs to be looked into, and a newer model or ways to deal with it needs to be taken into account as well. But that is never the case. It's constantly at the cost of like the poor farmers, the peasant communities, or the livestock pastoralist communities, or the indigenous communities that they are going ahead with. And Kaziranga so has like this whole very militarized form of protecting the area. Then the whole big capital tourist industry has come in a big way. The funding organizations also play a very big role. So you have like WWF and IUCN and IFO, and a lot of other organizations as well, who outrightly, I mean, definitely if we go through their uh, ideas of indigenous people, they claim that like they would always respect the rights of the indigenous people. They would stand for human rights, but that's not the case. When we see them truly in the ground, they are very opaque. They are nowhere to be found. They are never with the people. They are with hiding behind the safety and security of the state and the forest department, which is very unethical, I guess, which is an hypocrisy and a racism of some extremes. And this should be questioned as well. And we, as people who are risking our lives on a day-to-day basis, needs honesty from every quarters. People who claim to be working for the indigenous people, who claim to be writing for the indigenous people, who claim to be, I mean, creating discourses for these spaces. So, but yeah, sadly, that's not the truth. And a lot of time, I mean, so there's a conflict also of people in the ground who with this sort of NGOs and stuff, and and as a whole, like I guess the scenario is not very different in many other parts of the country. Uh, we have personally formed networks. There's a network called the Community Network Against Protected Areas, where young, politically motivated activists and community members from Tiger Project areas, the most violent, militarized areas in the country are the Tiger Project areas, and who came together to form this coalition and talk about the militarization and the colonial conservation, or the very racial and casteist discrimination that this very model embodies. So, I mean, it's a constant struggle, and we've been trying to form coalitions and also talk about these issues, try to uh, demand for policy changes, and in a way see if uh, people could come together and talk of a conservation model which is more conducive to the local indigenous communities, but that's not the case because of the vested interest of large capital, because of the vested interest of the state and the government. Now with newer economic models of carbon credit and carbon sequestering and all other concepts, I guess it is becoming even more riskier. And in India, with the modification or change in the conservation laws, it's becoming even more detrimental, where there's no regard for protected areas or the forest areas at all. Government and their business interest can do whatever they want, but not local indigenous communities or the legal or historical guardians of the spaces. Their rights have been completely wiped away. Though the Forest Right Act of India, which came after a historic struggle by activists and indigenous communities across the country for a very long time, which tried to try to address a lot of historical injustice that has been meted out to these communities, but the act is being today completely destroyed by the wildlife conservation lobby and the pro extractive economy lobby, like mining, say the oil, natural gas mining in Assam. I could say that, like now Dibru Saikwa, another national park, or Dihing Patkai, where there is a massive amount of illegal coal mining happening, and also like oil rigs are being sanctioned in these spaces. Vedanta, a company which has been notorious in the sense of violating indigenous peoples, have been given entry into these areas. Now there is also a concept of say wild, I mean we are scared that soon, like the Indian protected areas are also going to be privatized, and whatever little agency that we have as a democratic citizen to assert our rights is also going to be taken away. And the process has already started. The Prime Minister of India came to Kaziranga just 1 or 2 weeks back, and he has proposed a Vantara 2 version in Kaziranga, which I think it's very unethical in the very essence of keeping wild elephants or elephants and animals in a zoo. So I have already received the call that my time is running out, and I would like to kind of tell everyone that as in like it's election times in India, and I have been very busy with the elections on a regular basis and have not been able to give much time and thought to the talk today. But I hope I have made some sense, and I would definitely like to tie up the loose ends during the question and answer session. And thanks everyone for being patient listeners, and hope I could have seen you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Pranav, especially the powerful words against some of the private actors like IUCN, WWF, demanding honesty. At least that's what I think all of us expect from the non-state actors and non-government actors. And of course, the challenge of privatization of the national parks, I think then, of course, it becomes completely different from the challenges which we face. So I think we will have some question and answer sessions. If there is, I can see some questions there, but if there are other people who would like to raise questions, if Gavi or Michelle could kindly pass on some of the questions.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. And I think you should be able to hear people in the room if they have questions. So I'll just start with those first. If anyone in person has questions, yes.
I work with the indigenous people language at the shelter where a lot of people come to Tucson. I've seen a lot of people from Nepal. My question is this a result of the disposition of lands or something else that's going on in their community? That's the, I mean, the reason I leave Nepal.
Okay, were you able to hear that?
Shankar?
Could you please repeat it one more time, because
Sure. Do you want to come up to the front? We can have you talk into the mic.
We can hear it. Yeah, on Zoom we can hear it.
I don't think Shankar could. So if that's okay.
Yeah, my question is, as I said, I work with an office, indigenous language at the shelter where a lot of people come at immigration, drop them out. And recently I saw a lot of people from Nepal. So my question is this the result of disposition of land or something else? Like in Latin America, a lot of them, they come because they are threatened to death or torture. Everything. I don't know what exactly the result why Nepals are leaving their community.
Well, as far as what I understood from your question is, well, these peoples who are displaced from development aggressions or any kinds of development activities. So this that has a consequences to them. Yes, obviously, it has like many consequences if people are displaced from their original territory. And not only they lose about their subsistence, but they also lose their cultural identity also. That includes about the language and the many impacts we can see about it, right? So I agree what you have mentioning. Of course, that's the one catch.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yes. Okay, we have one other question coming up to the front of the room here.
Please.
No, just I want to say hello to my friend.
Hi, Juan.
Hi, how are you, my friend?
Yeah, good to see you.
Long time ago, since
Yes.
we drafted the United Nations
Declaration.
Declaration. So I remember you very well, and Chakma also, of course. So just I say hello and good luck.
Thank
We
you.
continue
Thank you, Juan.
with our struggle because we need it. We need to survive and to give
Absolutely.
a better world of our children and our 7th generation in the future. Okay, thank you.
So
Thank
lovely
you
to see you. So
understand.
lovely to see you, Juan.
Okay.
Wonderful. Do we have any others? Oh, yes. Sorry to make you come down to the front of the room. Okay, I don't know. It sounded like people.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for those really useful interventions. Good to see you, Shankar. Good to see you, Suhas. I just had a question because a number of you mentioned the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Are you engaging with the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity to strengthen the framework, for example, the monitoring mechanism, which is being discussed right now? Do you see that as a useful engagement? Do you have any hopes of strengthening how the framework might actually protect your rights in the context of conservation? Thanks.
Well, that's very interesting questions. It's unfortunate that I haven't been involved in these processes, but I was involved the other biodiversity initiative in international level. But in national level, this Kunming Montreal framework, we have been using as a tool that to recognize the indigenous peoples existing, the practice of customary conservations, right? So we see a lot of potentialities here because indigenous peoples are quite strong in many areas. Right now, I'm outside of Kathmandu Valley, so it is the place of Limbu people, where the huge customary forest it's protected by the indigenous peoples, and also this Limbu people, they had a treaty, the Dane state in 1774. It's a kind of treaty land. That treaty also provides a kind of space for Limbu people to exercise their autonomy and self-governance. That includes protecting or exercising rights over land, territories, and natural resources. And the one of customary, I mean, this we call is a customary forest. Particular term we call it a kipot, which is the collective land. There was carbon dating about the tree. Some trees are 2,800 years old. So this this forest is rich in biodiversity. Very closely, there is community forest, because the Nepal government really highlights the community forest, which is very successful project of the government. But if you look about the community forest, it's a monoculture, right? And then the animals like red pandas and deers and porcupines and squirrels, they choose the community, I mean, the customary forest to live there. So you don't see these kinds of animals in community forest. So that's, I mean, to tell you straight that even animal has a better choice, and that choice is indigenous people's customary forest, and that's why maybe we want to preserve it. And then this framework, we are talking with local government. We see this is an opportunity. I know there are challenges, we all know about it, but this can be a tool. We are using it. Let's see what will happen.
I have not been personally involved in it. I mean, to be frank, I think if you look at the text, the indigenous peoples, with the support of the certain governments, they have been quite effective. They have done a commendable job in terms of recognition of the indigenous people's perspective in the framework. I think the problem arises the functioning of the states. Certain states, they have the basic framework to implement the agreed framework at the international level. So there's some amount of willingness, and some states, even though they are part of the entire process, they're absolutely clueless. So I think when it comes to realizing the agreed framework at national level, it's completely different, because the debate which takes place at the national level, it moves within its own national framework, priorities, and etc. And often because of the very nature of the relationship between indigenous peoples and the government, indigenous peoples are not able to benefit from this kind of international processes. And it becomes more difficult when the governments are not, honest in terms of even presenting the truth, and that's a real problem. So, I mean, if you ask me, in India, for example, of course, we are concerned about target 3, but is the government moving in that direction? Yeah, obviously not. But they would like to take some credit for somewhere. But at the national level, I do not think the governments have a coherent policy that this is the way we'll implement agreed framework or agreed Montreal, Kunming framework. I don't think the government of India has, if you ask me, in India, has a plan of action that this is the way we will implement it. So it remains basically at the public discourse level, but not necessarily at the policy implementation. Maybe you can ask for the next questions if there are.
Sure, and I know that we're at time, but I think if our speakers have time for one more, I'll pull one from the Q&A here. Let's see. Are you able to see these, Suhas?
Yes, I'm able to see.
Okay, if we can start with this question here.
The mechanisms to hold these states accountable.
Yeah, so how can mechanisms be developed to hold states accountable for designating Indigenous peoples' territories as conservation areas without their consent? And how can states operationalize FPIC considering it is not legally binding?
Well, I think there's a legal gap because at what level or the threshold level or the starting point of exercising free, prior, informed consent. I think no state actually shares its powers, and designating a particular territory as a protected area is an exclusive domain of this state, and that's the way the states view, not only in this country, all over the world. So the FPIC, I mean, is not framed in a manner where your rights extend to at the start of the designation or official notification of a protected area, because before even you issue certain areas to be notified as a protected areas, of course, there are lots of procedural issues, including studies or the, or the field visits, number of things which the states have to undertake. And at that process, I think free, prior, informed consent cannot be invoked. And if you look at the free, prior, informed consent, both under the Panchayati Extension Act as well as the Forest Rights Act, the sectors are clearly identified. It's very limited. So that's one. The second is, how do you operationalize if it's not legally binding? I mean, in India, it's legally binding. If you look at the constitutional judgment from the Supreme Court of India, both in the Vedanta case as well as recent judgments which you had seen in the Chhattisgarh High Court, free, prior, informed consent, even for expansion of the protected areas, is mandatory. So if it is not something which is legally given, free, prior, informed consent, I don't think anybody can claim that we have the right to free and prior informed consent. And that's the problem with the areas. And I think when it comes to the companies, look, a company is a private entity. Its conduct is completely different, or its accountability is completely different from the state agencies. So that's why I think the states have a responsibility, but the free, prior, informed consent with respect to the companies actually comes through the state itself, because the state is in a way under the law is bound to implement that particular free, prior, and informed consent. The problem which we have is the private entities are actually hiding behind the back of the states. So even I think the private conservation actors like WWF, IUCN, etc., which Pranav had very, very, very beautifully mentioned, that they are always behind the forest department officials, the government officials. They are not to be seen anywhere. And as I had said, whatever they have in terms of grievance mechanism or rights-based approaches, this is lip service. It doesn't have any kind of verification or accountability mechanism. So that's the answer to the question which was raised.
Great. And I think that we have time for one last question. If we are able to answer this one here, which I'll read for folks in the room who can't see it. If protected laws in the states in India or anywhere in South Asia are not effectively implemented in protected areas, what will be the future perspective of maintaining right of self-determination over land and natural resources?
You want me to answer that, or?
If you wouldn't mind, yeah, I think, and that'll be our last question before we wrap up.
No, I think, I mean, in a country like India, right of self-determination is very loaded. And, it's not seen in that manner. The Panchayat, extension to Scheduled Areas Act and Forest Rights Act, it basically refers to Gram Sabha the rights of the Gram Sabha, which is the village council, at the lowest level. So you are not talking about self-determination in terms of land and territories. But if the states, as I said, adopt or enacted the laws, they are bound constitutionally to enforce and respect these laws. I think we have come across two problems with that. One problem is, although free, prior, and informed consent is required, the state and the private actors, especially those who are from the extractive industries, they have been manufacturing consent. So even although the Gram Sabha is required to give the consent, but for example, if you look at in Chhattisgarh, in the Hans Deer forest, there have been allegations that the consent of it's one of the big projects. The consent has been manufactured, but the authenticity of that has not been verified. So there's one problem. The second problem is that the states, on a daily basis, they violate the free, prior, informed consent. And at the end of the day, how many people can access the justice system? So that's why I think, unfortunate reality is, it's very difficult. It's an ongoing struggle, and often we are on the losing side.